The MRI scans are fake. I just proved it. 36 hours in the archives. Metadata showing healthy brains altered to look terminal. My hands shake as I shove the flash drive into my pocket, but the door slams open. Two orderlies block the exit, their faces blank. Sarah warned me security was tracking me, but I didn't listen. Now the files are burning through my pocket, and the stairwell is my only way out. Too late. The blue glow of the workstation hummed, casting Ethan's shadow against the sterile white tiles of the basement archive. His fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. He clicked through the encrypted layers of Thomas Reed's MRI folder, the cooling fans whirring like a distant jet engine. On the high-resolution monitor, the gray mass of a terminal tumor pulsed in a static loop. Ethan tapped a command to strip the rendering layers. The image flickered. The tumor vanished, replaced by a string of raw metadata stamped with a third-party software signature. His pulse kicked against his ribs. The malignancy existed only as lines of code injected into the scan 48 hours prior to Reed's surgery. A heavy scent of ozone and floor wax hung in the stagnant air as Ethan leaned closer, tracing the digital fingerprints of a deliberate forgery. Ethan felt the weight of the 12 floors above him pressing down. Silverwood Medical Center was a palace of glass and steel on the Chicago skyline. But down here, in the gut of the building, the air was thick with the smell of damp paper and the electric tang of overworked processors. He leaned in until his glasses nearly touched the screen. He wasn't just looking at a mistake. He was looking at a murder in progress. The data showed that the tumor was nothing more than a digital ghost, a phantom limb created by a programmer to justify a surgery that would likely kill a healthy man. The heavy fire door behind him groaned on its hinges. Ethan jerked his hand away from the mouse, the plastic clicking loudly in the hollow room. "Ethan, step away from the terminal," Sarah whispered. Her voice cracked, barely audible over the ventilation hum. She stood in the doorway, twisting a frayed lanyard between her tremors. "Security flagged your badge the second you swiped into this sublevel. They're tracking the terminal's GPS uplink." Ethan stared at the glowing fraud on the screen. "Sarah, Reed's brain is clean. They fabricated the entire pathology." "Leave it," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the hallway's overhead camera. "The shift supervisor is already on the elevator. If they find you logged into those specific files, you won't make it to the parking garage." Ethan grabbed a thumb drive, the metal casing cold and biting against his palm. He yanked it from the port and shoved it into his scrub pocket. The distant chime of the elevator echoed through the concrete corridor. 1, 2, 3. Ethan muttered under his breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He needed the count. He needed the sequence to stay sane. He shoved past Sarah, the scent of her lavender laundry detergent momentarily cutting through the ozone of the server room. "Ethan, wait," she called out, but her voice was a thin reed against the rising storm. The elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a heavy, mechanical thud. Two men stepped out. They weren't wearing the soft blue scrubs of healers. They wore the dark, tactical polos of Silverwood's internal risk management team. Their necks were thick, their knuckles scarred, and they moved with a predatory grace that had no place in a hospital. "Dr. Miller?" the first one said. His voice was like gravel grinding in a mixer. "You're in a restricted zone." Ethan didn't answer. He turned and bolted toward the heavy steel door of the supply closet. He could hear their boots thumping on the linoleum, a heavy, rhythmic sound that made the floor vibrate. He ducked inside the closet, the air smelling of bleach and industrial soap. His hands fumbled in the dark until they hit something cold and heavy. a stainless steel medical tray. As the door swung open, Ethan didn't hesitate. He swung the tray with every ounce of terror-fueled strength he possessed. It connected with the lead guard's temple with a sickening clang, like a bell tolling in a graveyard. The man slumped, his eyes rolling back as he hit the floor. The second guard lunged, his fingers clawing at Ethan's lab coat. Ethan twisted, the fabric tearing with a sharp screech, and shoved a heavy rolling cart of oxygen tanks into the man's path. The metal canisters crashed together, a series of hollow, ringing booms that echoed through the narrow space. Ethan didn't look back. He burst through the fire exit and hit the concrete stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, he gasped, his lungs burning. He reached the landing and threw himself against the heavy door leading to the parking garage. The cold night air of Chicago hit him like a physical blow, smelling of exhaust and Lake Michigan salt. He sprinted toward his aging Volvo, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He reached the car and fumbled with his keys, the metal biting into his shaking thumb. "Ethan!" He spun around. Sarah was standing by the concrete pillar, her face pale in the flickering fluorescent light of the garage. She wasn't running. She was just standing there, holding her phone. "Sarah, get in," Ethan urged, unlocking the door. "I have the drive. We can go to the police. We can stop this." Sarah didn't move. She looked at the ground, her shoulders hunched. "I can't, Ethan. You know? I had to tell them, right?" Ethan froze. The keys slipped from his hand and clattered onto the pavement. "What?" "They promised me the head nurse position," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "I have a mortgage, Ethan. I have a life. You're going to burn this whole place down, and I can't be inside when it happens. I gave them your access card. They know everything you downloaded." The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the solar plexus. The woman who had assisted him in 100 surgeries, the person he trusted with his patients' lives, had traded his head for a promotion. The achievement of the drive felt hollow, a weight in his pocket that now felt like a lead sinker pulling him into the depths. "You're a doctor, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice a low, jagged edge. "I'm a survivor," she replied, finally looking him in the eye. "And you?" "You're a ghost. You just don't know it yet." The sound of heavy tires screeching on concrete echoed from the ramp above. Ethan lunged for his keys, scrambled into the driver's seat, and slammed the car into reverse. He didn't look at Sarah as he sped away, leaving her standing in the shadows of the garage, a small, lonely figure in a cardigan. He drove aimlessly for 20 minutes, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. Chicago was a blur of neon and steel, a labyrinth he no longer felt safe in. He pulled into a rusted-out gas station on the edge of the city, the sign flickering with a dying hum. He needed fuel. He needed a plan. He swiped his card at the pump. Declined. He tried again, pressing the plastic into the slot until his knuckles turned white. Declined. Panic, cold and sharp, crawled up his spine. He pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. The screen flashed red. "Account frozen. Contact representative." "No," he whispered, the word lost in the wind. He checked his email. There was a single message at the top of his inbox, time-stamped 5 minutes ago. The sender was the Illinois State Medical Board. Notice of emergency suspension. The text was clinical and cold, accusing him of gross negligence and the theft of controlled substances. In the span of an hour, Robert Sterling hadn't just chased him out of the building. He had erased Ethan's life. His phone began to vibrate in his palm. The caller ID was blocked. Ethan stared at it for 3 rings before sliding his thumb across the glass. "Ethan," the voice said. It was Robert Sterling. The tone was oily, a slow, predatory glide that made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up. We find ourselves, do we not, at a rather delicate intersection of interests. I have the MRI files, Robert. Ethan spat, leaning against the cold metal of his car. I have the proof that you're murdering people for insurance payouts. Proof is a subjective term, Ethan. Right now, the only proof the world sees is a disgruntled doctor who stole a hard drive and fled the scene of an assault. But it doesn't have to be this way. We want what's best for the institution, don't we? Sterling paused, the silence on the line heavy with unspoken threats. I'm prepared to offer you a way out. A multi-million-dollar research grant. A private lab in San Diego. Your license restored by morning. All I need is that drive. Think of your family, Ethan. Think of the cost of a misunderstanding. Thomas Reed is a human being, Ethan said, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and exhaustion. Not a data point. Thomas Reed is a tragedy that hasn't happened yet, Sterling countered. But your tragedy, that's already in motion. You have 4 hours, Ethan. 4 hours until Mr. Reed receives his final, terminal dose. I suggest you spend them wisely. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone, then at the stolen tablet he'd grabbed from the nurse's station on his way out. He pulled up the schedule. Sterling wasn't lying. At 6 a.m., Thomas Reed was scheduled for an experimental infusion, a cocktail of drugs designed to look like a failed treatment for a non-existent tumor. It was an execution disguised as an accident. He hopped back into the Volvo, his mind racing. He had to get to a contact at the Department of Health. He had to show someone the drive. He slammed the car into gear and floored it, the engine roaring in protest. As he hit the highway, the steering wheel felt loose in his hands. He tapped the brakes to slow for a curve. The pedal went straight to the floor. No, no, no! Ethan screamed, pumping the pedal frantically. There was no resistance. The car accelerated down the rain-slicked incline, the speedometer climbing toward 80. He pulled the emergency brake, but the cable snapped with a metallic twang that sounded like a gunshot. The world became a blur of rushing lights and screaming wind. Ethan gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes wide. He saw the ditch approaching, a steep, grassy embankment leading down to a frozen creek. He steered into it, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The impact was a bone-jarring explosion of sound. The airbag deployed with a hot, chemical stench, slamming into Ethan's face and plunging him into darkness. He woke to the smell of smoke and the rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine. His head throbbed, a warm trickle of blood running down his temple. He crawled out of the shattered window, his boots crunching on the frozen grass. The Volvo was a twisted wreck of metal and glass, but he was alive. He reached into his pocket. The drive was still there. He began to walk. Every step was a struggle, his body screaming in protest. He made it back to his apartment complex in the gray light of pre-dawn, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He needed cash. He had an emergency stash in the floorboards under the bed. He reached his door and stopped. It was standing ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, hanging in jagged shards. Ethan drew a slow, trembling breath. He pushed the door open. The apartment was a ruin. The sofa had been ripped open, the stuffing scattered like snow. His books were tossed across the floor, their spines broken. A shadow moved in the kitchen. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and bolted, his feet pounding on the carpeted hallway. He heard the heavy thud of boots behind him. A man burst from the apartment, thick-necked, wearing a nondescript gray hoodie. Ethan scrambled down the back fire escape, the metal stairs clanging under his weight. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted, his voice a frantic whisper. He hit the alleyway, the smell of rotting garbage and wet brick filling his lungs. The man, the fixer, was fast. He leaped from the bottom of the stairs, landing with a heavy thud. Ethan ducked behind a dumpster, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around wildly. His eyes landed on a red canister bolted to the brick wall. A fire extinguisher. He ripped it from the bracket just as the fixer rounded the corner. The man had a knife, the blade gleaming like a cold tooth in the moonlight. "Gimme the drive, Doc," the man rasped, "and I'll make it quick." Ethan didn't speak. He pulled the pin and squeezed the handle. A violent cloud of white chemical powder erupted from the nozzle, hissing like 1,000 snakes. The fixer screamed, clutching his eyes as the caustic dust blinded him. Ethan lunged forward, swinging the heavy canister like a club. It hit the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The fixer crumpled, the knife clattering onto the asphalt. Ethan stood over him, his chest heaving. He reached down and pulled back the man's hood. Then, he reached into the man's pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open. A silver badge caught the dim light. Chicago Police Department, Officer James Murphy. Ethan's knees went weak. He slumped against the brick wall, the cold stone biting into his back. The conspiracy wasn't just Sterling. It wasn't just the hospital. It was the city. The people who were supposed to protect him were the ones trying to kill him. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was his wife, Amanda. "Ethan?" Her voice was a frantic, high-pitched sob. "Ethan, they're here. Men in suits. They say they're from Child Protective Services. They're taking the kids, Ethan. They say you're a danger to us." "Amanda, listen to me," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Don't let them in. Lock the doors." "It's too late," she shrieked. "They have a court order. Ethan, what did you do? What did you do?" The line cut out. Ethan stared at the dead screen. He was alone. His money was gone. His career was over. His family was being torn apart. And in less than 2 hours, Thomas Reed would be dead. He looked at the fire extinguisher, then at the unconscious cop at his feet. He felt a cold, hard resolve settle in his gut. Sterling thought he had won. He thought he had broken the man who counted stairs. But Ethan Miller wasn't done counting. He made his way to a small satellite clinic 3 blocks away, a place where he'd done some volunteer work years ago. He knew the keypad code. He slipped inside, the air smelling of rubbing alcohol and old magazines. He found a terminal in the back office. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He didn't use his own login. He used a back door he discovered during a system update months ago. He navigated through the hospital's internal network, his eyes burning from the glare of the screen. He found the pharmacy queue. There it was. Reed, Thomas, infusion 402-B, scheduled for 6 o'clock. He began to type, a frantic, rhythmic tapping that was the only sound in the dark room. Delete, override, cancel. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%, 20%. "Come on," he whispered, his hands shaking. "Come on." The door to the office creaked open. Ethan didn't look up. He couldn't. 30%, 40%. "It's a valiant effort, Ethan." "Truly," Robert Sterling said. Ethan froze. He slowly turned his head. Sterling was standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed guards. He looked impeccable, his charcoal suit without a single wrinkle, his white shirt glowing in the dark. "How did you find me?" Ethan asked, his voice a hollow rasp. "We own the lines, Ethan. Every bit of data that moves through this city is ours. You're like a fly in a web, vibrating the silk with every move you make. Sterling walked toward the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the screen. 60%. You think you're the hero of this story, Sterling said, leaning in close. His breath smelled of expensive mints and cold ambition. But you're just a glitch, and glitches get patched. He reached out and grabbed Ethan's wrist, his grip like a steel band. With his other hand, he reached into Ethan's pocket and pulled out the flash drive. "This is what all the fuss is about?" Sterling asked, holding the small metal object between two fingers. A few lines of code, a few digital ghosts. He dropped the drive onto the floor and brought his heel down on it. The sound of crushing plastic and metal was loud in the quiet room. "No!" Ethan lunged, but the guards were on him in a second, pinning his arms behind his back. Sterling smiled, that cold, predatory expression that never reached his eyes. "You want to know the best part, Ethan? You want to know why you were never going to win?" He leaned in until his nose was inches from Ethan's. "Your father, Richard Miller. He was one of our first investors. He knew about the Reed trials. He knew about the adjustments. He bought his retirement with the lives of people like Thomas Reed. It's in the blood, Ethan. You're part of the machine, whether you like it or not." The world tilted. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. His father? The man who had taught him the Hippocratic Oath? The man who had given him his first stethoscope? "You're lying," Ethan hissed. "Check the ledger, Ethan, if you can find it." Sterling stood up and straightened his tie 3 times. "Take him back to the hospital. Plant the weapon. Let's finish this." The guards dragged Ethan to his feet. One of them pulled a black handgun from a holster and shoved it into Ethan's waistband. Dr. Miller was distraught. Sterling said to the empty room, "He broke into the clinic looking for drugs. When we tried to stop him, he became violent. It's a tragedy, really." They threw Ethan into the back of a black SUV and sped toward Silverwood. The city was waking up, the sky turning a bruised purple over the lake. They locked him in a secure room on the 14th floor, a windowless box designed for combative patients. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, the plastic biting into his skin. He sat on the cold floor, his head bowed. 1, 2, 3, he whispered. He looked up at the ceiling. He knew this room. He'd helped design the layout of this wing. Above the acoustic tiles was the ventilation trunk, the main artery of the fire suppression system. He stood up and backed against the wall. He used his height to press his shoulder against the latch of the ceiling tile. It popped upward. He struggled, his muscles screaming, until he managed to hook his bound hands over the edge of the metal frame. He pulled, the zip ties slicing into his wrists. With a grunt of agony, he threw his weight downward. The tile shattered, and with it, the red glass bulb of the fire sprinkler. A deafening alarm erupted, a high-pitched wail that vibrated through the floor. A second later, the room was filled with a thick, white chemical fog. The fire suppression dump. Ethan didn't wait. He used the sharp edge of the broken ceiling tile to saw through the plastic ties. His hands came free, his skin raw and bleeding. He burst through the door just as the guards were fumbling with their gas masks in the hallway. The fog was a wall of white, blinding and choking. Ethan knew the turns. He knew the count. 12, 13, 14, he whispered, sprinting through the chaos. He didn't head for the exit. He headed for the ballroom. Tonight was the annual Silverwood Gala, the Visionaries of Healing dinner. The room would be filled with the city's elite, the donors, the politicians, the media. He reached the service entrance of the ballroom. He could hear the low hum of conversation. the clinking of crystal, the soft strains of a string quartet. He slipped into the AV booth, the technician having fled when the fire alarm started chirping. He looked at the massive control board. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He hadn't just been hacking the pharmacy queue at the clinic, he'd been recording. He plugged the phone into the surgical broadcast Wi-Fi, the system used to stream live operations to the ballroom's massive 4K screens. On the stage, Robert Sterling was stepping up to the podium. He looked magnificent in his tuxedo, the light catching the silver at his temples. "We are here tonight to celebrate the future," Sterling began, his voice amplified by the massive speakers. "A future where illness is a memory, where data serves the patient, where Silverwood—" Ethan hit play. The massive screens behind Sterling flickered to life. But it wasn't the promotional video of smiling children and high-tech labs. It was a video of a darkened office. It was Sterling's face, close and clear. "Your father, he bought his retirement with the lives of people like Thomas Reed. It's in the blood, Ethan. You're part of the machine." The ballroom went silent. The only sound was the clink of a dropped fork. Sterling froze. He turned, his face pale in the glow of his own confession. The experimental drugs weren't just for toxicity. They were placebos used to embezzle billions, making the murders even more senseless. Ethan stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the ballroom. He was covered in blood, his scrubs torn, his hair matted with chemical dust. "The numbers don't lie, Robert," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the vaulted space. "But you do." The room erupted. Security lunged for the stage, but the crowd was already moving. Cameras were flashing, people were screaming. And then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open. Dozens of agents in blue jackets with FBI in bold yellow letters swarmed the floor. They didn't go for Ethan. They went for the stage. Jennifer Lopez, the lead agent, stepped forward, her leather-bound folio tucked under her arm. She straightened her tie 3 times and looked Sterling in the eye. "Robert Sterling," she said, her voice calm and clinical. "You are under arrest for healthcare fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. We have the ledger, and we have the witness." Ethan slumped against the railing. He watched as they led Sterling away in handcuffs, the visionary looking small and broken in his expensive suit. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was his father. Richard Miller looked older than Ethan had ever seen him, his face a map of regret. "Ethan," he whispered. Ethan didn't look at him. "The wound must be closed, Dad, even if the glass is still inside." He walked away, his boots clicking on the marble floor. 6 months later. The air in the small town of Oak Haven, Illinois, smelled of pine and fresh rain. It was a quiet place, a world away from the glass and steel of Chicago. Ethan sat in his modest clinic, the walls painted a soft, calming blue. He didn't have a high-resolution monitor or tactical security team. He had a stethoscope, a notebook, and a jar of lollipops on the counter. He looked at his watch. 9 a.m. The door opened, the bell chiming a soft, silver note. A man walked in. He was older, his hair thin, but his skin had a healthy glow. He stood tall, his shoulders no longer hunched. "Morning, Doc," Thomas Reed said, a wide smile on his face. Ethan stood up, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "Morning, Thomas. How's the knee?" "Better than ever. I even started a garden, just like my Martha used to have." Ethan smiled. He walked toward the exam room, his mind clear, his soul at peace. 1, 2, 3, he counted as he walked. But this time, he wasn't counting because he was afraid. He was counting because every step mattered. And for the first time in his life, the sequence was exactly right.